Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your support of our events. My name is Paul Sherman, and I'm the Director of Programs for SID-W. So I don't want to take up too much time because I know we have a packed schedule for this event, but I do just want to take a moment to first thank our co-chairs, our great co-chairs, Shamaruk and Mike. They've done a really great job with this event and moving this forward, even though it's been in the works since before COVID times. So we appreciate you moving this forward in this very timely event, given that it's Women's History Month. So thanks for moving this forward. I obviously also want to thank our speakers as well for taking the time out of their schedules and also battling time zones to keep this event to speak with our community about this topic. We really appreciate it. So I think most of you are familiar with who we are, but for those who aren't, we're a neutral convener in the international development space for networking and information sharing. So these types of events are really our bread and butter. We do almost an event per week. We almost average an event per week. So there's always something going on. So check out our website for more about our upcoming events. We have a few coming up for the rest of this month and also into April. And April should be pretty busy as well. So just stay tuned. I don't want to take up more time than that. So I'll hand it off to Shamaruk and Mike to get us started. I'll also, just as an FYI, this event is being recorded and will be posted to YouTube afterwards. So just for everyone's awareness. And with that, I will hand it over to the co-chairs.
Thank you, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Shamaruk Mohiuddin. I'm a principal associate at Nathan Associates, which is a global consulting firm focusing on international development issues. There are a number of topics that we work in, including economic empowerment, gender and social inclusion, private sector development, trade, financial solutions, etc. And we work with both the public and the private sectors. And I have Mike Ingram, my co-chair for the Working Group for Corporate Role and Development with me. And we'll just quickly go to Mike to introduce himself as well and talk about one of our upcoming events. And then we'll introduce the topic for today and introduce the speakers. So Michael.
Great. Thanks, Shamaruk, and thanks for your leadership in putting this event together. As Shamaruk said, I'm Mike Ingram. I'm a senior manager with Accenture Development Partnerships, a social enterprise within Accenture's commercial strategy group supporting the international development sector. As Shamaruk mentioned, in addition to this event, which you're attending today, our working group also has put together an event on Tuesday, April 6th, focused on USAID's public-private partnerships and a recent study called Enduring Results 3.0 that they've released. And so we'll have Todd Mullenkamp from USAID's Private Sector Engagement Hub, along with CRS, Johnson & Johnson, and USAID field representatives on a panel to discuss the reports and the implications for the sector. So hope many of you will be able to join, and I will pass it back to Shamaruk.
Thank you, Mike. So today we're focusing on gender equality and corporate partnerships, two topics I care about a lot. I've been working on these issues for quite some time, and really excited to have a panel of excellent speakers on this topic. And the reason we're discussing it also is because March is Women's History Month. So we really want to explore how cross-sector partnerships can advance gender equality. Data shows that we still have a long way to go on women's economic empowerment, and global GDP could be $1 trillion lower in 2030 if we didn't have the same opportunities for women as we do for men in the workplace, marketplace, and community. So the idea is to discuss how governments and private sector can find common ground on these issues, where they can leverage each other's strengths, and how global NGOs can also approach corporate partnerships, since we know that a number of the participants today are from the NGO sector. So the objective is to discuss how corporate partnerships can support women in accessing economic resources and thrive as workers, leaders, and entrepreneurs. We'll also explore what the unique capabilities are for government and the private sector, and what kind of legal, social, and economic barriers are holding women back where these sectors can play a role. And we have speakers from both the private and the public sectors, and our private sector speakers have also worked with the public sector, advising governments or within governments, so they'll bring a unique perspective on the issue. And also we'll discuss how investments in gender can lift up whole communities and why it's so important for corporations to focus on women. And how can we broadly create an enabling environment for women? So beyond kind of access to economic resources, what kind of legal reforms are needed and how they can be achieved as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful speakers. We have Alison Eskison, who's the Vice President of Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth. And Alison will talk more about the center. She's been leading the company's regional philanthropic initiatives and is based in Singapore and has played a significant role in global development issues and has been in this sector for over 20 years. We have Jeff Halverson, who's a senior manager at PepsiCo for global sustainability, and he supports the company's objectives in sustainable sourcing. He helps partner with a number of external organizations, including other companies, development finance institutions, and private foundations as well. Has also worked with USAID on a number of partnerships. Then we have Lauren Scott, who's the Economic Policy Advisor at the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the Department of State. And Lauren also brings a breadth of experience on these issues, having worked on trade issues, agriculture, environment, and obviously gender issues in Africa and Asia. And we'll hear from her from the government perspective, as well as what the Biden administration's plan is on gender equality issues. So thank you all for joining today. And I'm excited to kick off this discussion with a few questions. So if I could just maybe ask each speaker to go over why you care about this topic of gender equality and why it's important for your company, and for Lauren, we'll talk about what the government's focus is these days on this issue and what are the top most issues of priority for the government. So we'll go to Alison first, and then Lauren. Alison.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm excited to join all the way from Singapore. I imagine that many of you are in the US, if not in Washington. And so for us, gender equality, particularly women's economic empowerment, is incredibly important for all the statistics, right? So the fact that if you had women engaged, you'd see an increase in GDP in almost every country, as pointed out by the IMF, all the way through to thinking about the multiplier effect that happens when women have control and are earning money, and the financial decisions they make in their household, and how that disproportionately benefits families and children. But at the end of the day, as a private sector company, we also recognize that having equal women economic participation is simply good for business, that women make substantial decisions around how the household spends money. And for all private sector companies, you want to see women empowered because they are controlling those decisions. And for most of us, we're selling a product or a service. And so how do you start to think about that as part of your business mandate?
Thank you, Alison. Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, Shamaruk. I think I'll just build on Alison's point. It just makes business sense for us. And I work in the world of kind of sustainable agriculture supply chains. And so from our perspective, I think from a general point of view, if we're trying to create sustainable or resilient supply chains, we need sustainable and resilient farmers. And to do that, especially in the face of climate change and the variety of challenges that are facing farmers, we need to have an inclusive set of solutions. We can't be exclusive. And being inclusive means that we're thinking about everybody in the supply chain and what those people do, and how to best empower them to ensure their success, which then ensures our own success. I think from a very tactical perspective, we're looking at we source a lot of potatoes because we own Frito-Lay, and so like think of your Frito-Lay, your Lay's potato chips. We have found through partnerships with USAID, for example, that the defect rate goes down when we are working more and more with women, or we are actively engaging them. So we're actually seeing changes in the KPIs that are central to our agronomists or to our procurement teams. So yields are going up, yields are more stable, turnover is going down, defects are going down, so the quality goes up. So those things that are very tactical and very like quarterly based, we're seeing that kind of impact too. So to Allison's point, like the business case, it becomes much clearer when we actively engage women.
Thank you. Great to hear you articulate the business case in terms of consumer decisions as well as women's role in the supply chain for PepsiCo. So Lauren, let's come to you on the government's view on these issues, and also if you could expand your remarks to include what are the main sort of legal and cultural barriers that hold women back that this administration is focused on. Thank you.
Sure, and thank you, Shamaruk, and thank you everyone for participating today. It's great to be here. So I would start just by saying that the U.S. government views gender equity and equality as not just a moral imperative, but it's also a strategic imperative to reduce poverty, promote economic growth, and foster democracy around the world. And as some of you may be aware, on March 8th, which was International Women's Day, President Biden issued an executive order on the establishment of the White House Gender Policy Council. We're very excited about this new council, and it's been established at the highest level, reporting directly to the president, and it reiterates the US government's revitalized commitment to working toward global gender equality. The United States is fully committed to creating policies and programs that improve the conditions that facilitate women's role in the workforce and enable them to succeed in the global economy. And yes, Shamaruk, this absolutely includes reducing legal, structural, cultural, other barriers that get in the way of women being fully successful in the economy. We tackle those barriers in a number of ways, working with the private sector and others, working directly with countries to amend laws on their books and to implement those changes. A big resource for us and a big partner for us is the World Bank and their Women Business and the Law Report. So we've looked at a number of issues and barriers that restrict women's access to the economy, looking specifically at women's access to credit, for example, their ability to be successful as entrepreneurs, looking at barriers to women's ability to travel freely, for example. A lot of countries restrict women's ability to move freely without their husband's or another man's permission to travel, even locally or internationally. And obviously that can have huge impacts for their economic empowerment and just to be able to run a business successfully or participate in the workforce. And all of this, of course, is especially true as we're approaching the post-COVID-19 recovery. We need to pay careful attention to make up the ground that's been lost due to the economic recession and its disproportionate impacts on women. As I mentioned, at the State Department and across the US government, we're partnering with the private sector. We're working together with other governments, civil society, to increase women's access to skills training. Another thing that the Biden administration is particularly focused on is STEM education, so science, technology, engineering, and math, and technology and critical sectors that will help us to rebuild from the pandemic and really be future oriented in terms of the careers of the future. And as my colleagues have said, as Allison and Jeff mentioned, all of this supports the business case, why women need to be fully empowered, fully included in the labor force. It helps to meet our global demands in the labor market now and into the future.
Thank you, Lauren. It's really great to hear what kind of the main priorities are and how they can also relate to the business sector. And if I could ask maybe Jeff and Allison to also talk about how some of these priorities might relate to your business and what are some legal barriers that you come across in your business when doing your sustainability work as well, where you feel that women are being held back and you need more engagement on these issues. Jeff, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. In terms of some of the barriers that we're finding through this work, I think if I step back, I would say that in agriculture and in kind of commodity procurement in general, it tends to be a male-dominated sector or a male-dominated kind of industry. And so when we think about like it's just business, right? So it's this gender blind approach, but because we haven't invited everybody to the table, it's actually, there's a good possibility that it's gender biased. And I think that's been one of the big things that our team, our eyes have kind of opened up to this, to that possibility through this work, and especially the partnerships that we've been embarking on. And in that process, we're learning about things like, access to land rights, child care, and how women are not coming to our training days at a particular demo farm because they've got kids and because we haven't really set up times or locations for them to come to these things. And so it's these kind of unconscious, they're just decisions. These decisions are then leading to kind of an exclusion of everybody in some of our supply chains, and this work has kind of opened our eyes to that. And so things like gender-based violence wasn't really that was not in our vernacular, months ago, but is now becoming part of the thing that we're talking about. Is how do we set up demo farms, and how do we do kind of farmer capacity building, knowing that a large percentage of the supply chain has not been really engaged before. So I think those are some of the things that we're learning, and those are some of the barriers. And we're doing work with a variety of partners in a variety of countries, and so the cultural barriers are distinct in each one of those. But I think I'll stop there in terms of what we're finding across those countries.
Jeff, I have to say, I love the fact that you recognize gender imbalance in the work that you're doing, even when it's unintentional, and how do you correct that? That's one of the things that we see as well, is particularly on the business side, if they're rolling out a product, they are rolling out a product because they're trying to go to market. And sometimes there's just inadvertent gender imbalances. And when you acknowledge those and you're able to then try to mitigate them, it's an incredibly powerful effect. One, because it, as Jeff says, sort of opens our own eyes and starts to really help us transition. What does business as usual look like? And how do we start to ask some of those questions up front so we don't make the same mistake in the next country that we roll it out in? For us, we focus a lot on the digital economy and the opportunities that the digital economy could bring, and particularly how that might benefit women. And there's certainly some hurdles that have to be overcome in order to truly see equity and inclusiveness in the digital economy. It can be everything from very small things like who owns the smartphone, who controls the smartphone in a rural household, all the way through to do you have the knowledge and the skills and the know-how to actually use that as a productive tool. But we've seen, particularly in ASEAN, but also in South Asia, maybe in a slightly different way, but in ASEAN, we've seen a lot of the small sellers that come onto these digital marketplaces, whether it's the Tokopedia, the Bukalapak, even things like Grab, where you have restaurants and sort of delivery services. It's a sort of a combination of a variety of different platforms that you have in the US, but all those platforms have a disproportionate number of women showing up, creating small businesses out of their household. And for us, what's important is if they've taken that first step, how do we make certain that we're empowering them with the skills, the technology, the tools, the know-how, the access to credit, the opportunity to grow their market, so that they're not hobby businesses, they're not in survival mode, but they have this exponential opportunity to really expand and grow. And for us, that's where we see this opportunity to layer philanthropic work with private sector services and products. And sometimes they're our own, sometimes they're other people's, but we see that that combination is incredibly powerful because it does start to enable us to reach scale, but also galvanizes the strength that the private sector has in terms of really pushing things. And from a development standpoint, starts to really change mindsets and start to change what does business as usual look like as we think about really providing services and products that are tailored for the needs of the base of the pyramid.
Thank you, Allison. If I could just ask a follow-up question, you mentioned that the private sector can play a role in pushing things. What did you mean by that in terms of kind of the role that it plays within a country in terms of interacting with the different players that are decision makers on these issues?
Certainly. I'll give you an example. It's actually not even from my region, although we're replicating it. So we have a collaboration with Unilever at a global level. And together we sat down and said, how can we figure out ways in which to cooperate? And so we were talking about pain points that both as from a commercial standpoint, we recognize. And one of the things that Unilever said was their very small mom and pop neighborhood shops that sell their products had a limited access to credit. Therefore, what happens on a weekly basis is it depends on which salesman shows up first, right? If it's the PepsiCo salesman, you're going to buy more Pepsi. If it happens to be the Coca-Cola one, you're going to buy more Coca-Cola. And it just happens to be who's scrambling the fastest. And this is because they have limited cash flow and therefore have trouble future planning. So if you have a big festival coming up, you may not be able to buy as much inventory as you want just because you weren't planning well enough. And so we were talking about, how do you start to think about alternative data? What does this mean? And Unilever was sharing with us the level of data that they have. So we went to our network, to our customers and banks and said, would you be willing to look at a digital solution that provides supplier credit based on the sales data that Unilever has on these shops? So you're not relying solely on the bookkeeping of a teeny tiny informal shop. You're not relying on collateral, but you're starting to think about cash flow based lending based on credible data that a big corporate is providing you. And we created a digital solution. And this was done in Kenya. And what we saw from an independent impact assessment is that sales went up almost by 20%. So it was a pretty substantial gain. And certainly for Unilever, it's a gain because they're selling more product. For the bank, it's a gain because they're opening up new customers and they're starting to establish a credit history to understand sort of who's bankable and who's not. And for us, it was a digital solution. So it ran off the rails that MasterCard has, which is all fantastic. From the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth side, we're the philanthropic hub of the company, we provided training and we did the impact assessments to understand what works, what doesn't work. And for us, it was particularly important that the needs of those little mom and pop shops was front and center so that it doesn't become predatory lending, right? Like you have sort of all these big conglomerates pushing products out that may or may not be useful for a shopkeeper. Also, as you move from an informal lending environment to a formal lending environment, you get into these positions where you could actually ruin your credit history very quickly because you simply didn't realize that your amortization schedule is set. There is no flexibility to say, oh, I'll pay next week or I'll pay tomorrow in the way that you do have that flexibility with an informal lender. And what's interesting, though, is we took that model from Kenya and we're replicating it in Asia. And we found that the stores that Unilever has sales data on tend to be the larger stores in this particular country. Because they're the larger stores, they tend to be owned and operated by men. So where we went in Kenya from having about 70% of the shops be women-led, in India, where we're looking to replicate, it was 97% of the shops were owned or run by men. And so we saw this gender imbalance and said, how do we correct it, right? Like we literally sort of took a step back and said, that was not what we were expecting. And so we actually went to USAID and said, we see a gender imbalance. can we work together from a philanthropic perspective to really build out a women's economic empowerment so that we grow these small women-led Kirana shops to a point where they can connect into a FMCG supply chain. And so it's a really interesting sort of moment for us of realizing a gender imbalance, correcting it, and as well as building out a public-private partnership that has this opportunity to really transform the way we think about access to credit.
Thanks, Allison. It's really good to hear about projects that kind of lead you to the next solution, and not realizing sort of the gender issues embedded within credit at first, and then sort of coming up on new solutions and new partners. And corporate to corporate partnerships are also really important, because you need to have different companies leveraging their unique capabilities. So great to hear about your collaboration with Unilever on that. If I could come to Jeff next about public-private partnerships, how you've worked with the government on your initiatives, both at the HQ level or even on the ground in particular countries.
Yeah, the one that I was referring to, we've got a couple interesting partnerships with USAID, which I think is relevant to this crowd. One is in West Bengal, India, and that was with folks from the gender development team at USAID, and then that spurred a large global GDA with USA and its gender equality hub, and that is in India, Pakistan, Colombia, and Vietnam. And so that's the big partnership that I'm working on right now, and it's a really interesting one because it has a fairly flexible model in that we didn't know what we wanted to do when we first started, and it was built into the process to do a gender supply chain assessment. So really looking at how does a potato get into a Frito-Lay plant, and who are all the people involved in that process, and what do they do, what could they be doing, and what should they be doing, and then taking all that information and co-creating some type of solution with USAID, so at the global level as well as at the mission level, involving our global team as well as our local procurement team, and then having probably 3 years of implementation after that, with a lot of because it's USAID, a lot of M&E and a lot of data collection, with the hope that what we're learning in this process is something that PepsiCo can then take and do on its own. And we can take the learnings from these 4 countries and then apply them to other supply chains and other countries. So ones that we have a direct relationship with farmers, where it's a lot easier for us to work directly with farmers because we're buying directly from them. And then other supply chains where we're buying through an intermediary or a set of intermediaries, and looking at what can we learn from directly working with farmers and what works, to how can we work with our suppliers to then work with the farmers and find what works. Really interesting. And we launched that last year. COVID really put the brakes on a lot of stuff, so we're moving into implementation now. We should have a lot more learnings to share, probably I'd say next year, which are really exciting. So that's one that I think is really, really good, and it has spurned others with folks like the Inter-American Development Bank, that is very similar, because I think a lot of folks are really interested in this idea of proving the business case for women's economic empowerment in a very tactical way. So the last thing I'll say to this is that when we started this, we were doing all this research, and everything was just kind of very broad. Like, if you work with women, like, everybody benefits, and there's like this missing amount of money that you could go after. And we're like, it doesn't really land anywhere, especially with a procurement function that is thinking about like a monthly KPI or a quarterly KPI. There wasn't a lot there. And so this partnership with USAID is really cool, because it allows us space to try things, to show again how there are changes to the things that our procurement teams really care about in a time frame that they care about, which then shows that there's a different way of doing business. So that's what we're really trying to do with this partnership with USAID is show that there's a better way of doing business. There's a better way to achieve the traditional KPIs that are most important to some of our business colleagues, and in the process, change behavior. And I think that's one of the biggest things, that I've heard from Allison and Lauren that we're getting into is, again, like behavior change is kind of where I live now, which is not something I think that you would expect to hear from like a supply chain, a corporate supply chain position.
Thanks, Jeff. It's so important to bridge these two worlds, and I'm sure you kind of bring experience from the government side of things into this as well, and bridging the lexicon in the development space especially. So Lauren, we'll come to you next about the partnerships that you could outline with the private sector. And if I could also ask participants to type in your questions in the chat box. We're collecting questions now and we'll come to you later. And I have a couple now already. So Lauren.
Sure, thank you. Before we get to specific partnerships, I just really wanted to acknowledge what Allison and Jeff have shared, and just recognizing how important the leadership of the private sector is on these issues. From a U.S. government perspective, we advocate for for policy reforms with partner governments, for ways for women to be more economically empowered, to have better access to economic resources, and to be, more well-equipped in their economies. But it's so important that the private sector also take that lead and be advocating for those changes on the ground. And also, with the governments, again, making the business case. So such great news to hear from Allison and Jeff, and just wanted to acknowledge that. In terms of, a couple relevant public-private partnerships, I'd like to highlight two that are very relevant to our discussion. The first on structural reform. So just earlier this month, the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues at the State Department, we launched the National Women's Business Agendas for Central Asia project, which is led by the Women and Girls Empowered with a Wage Consortium, and it's supported through a partnership with USAID. And this initiative is led by the Center for International Private Enterprise in partnership with the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative, which is ABA ROLI. And the project will convene a diverse group of stakeholders to identify barriers to women's economic participation, offer recommendations for reform, and advocate for those recommendations to governments through public-private dialogues. And the National Women's Business Agendas will be developed in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyz Republic, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And women in Turkmenistan as well will receive some support to form a women's business association. So we're really excited about this project. And the other one I wanted to highlight, we've talked, Allison in particular has mentioned digital inclusion. Also, going back to STEM being a priority, we have a partnership with Google. This is through our POWER program, which is in the State Department's Economic Bureau. POWER stands for Providing Opportunities for Women's Economic Rise. And the partnership that we have with Google spans across North Africa and the Middle East. It leverages Google's technical expertise and the State Department's diplomacy tools to convene like-minded partners to support women in the tech industry and provide mentoring opportunities. So, launching this program, it will first be implemented in collaboration with our U.S. embassies in Bahrain, Egypt, and the UAE. And each of those governments are also supporting this effort, which makes it all the more effective. And in this program, it will be a four-week period. We'll have a select group of women tech founders in the region that will receive technical and soft skills training from Google. And going back to the mentorship aspect, will also help to support building networks that span both the region and the US.
Thank you, Lauren. I have a number of questions about partnerships, and I know that some of our audience wants to hear about how partnerships actually work, but I wanted to just bring up one question that came in through the chat in the meantime, because it's relevant to some topics we've discussed. So we were discussing earlier about legal barriers that women face, and just wondering, this is the question that came in from one of the participants about gender-based violence, because it was referenced earlier, I think in Jeff's remarks, and if anyone else wants to add anything as well. Is that something that is a priority for your companies? And if so, how are you addressing that? Because ultimately we are talking about systemic change and transformational partnerships. So is it something that you have prioritized within your company and your supply chains? And what kind of conversations are going on about that? So maybe Jeff and then Allison.
It's all new, because these are things that we didn't, in my world. I mean, PepsiCo has 270,000 employees, so please take whatever I say with a grain of salt. So in my tiny little microcosm, these are fairly new conversations. And so the good thing is that we get to do this in collaboration with USAID and some really good implementers. One is Resonance Global, that is doing the kind of the prime work, and they've been working at this intersection of public and private and emerging markets for a long time. That's provided a lot of expertise. And then ICRW is also part of the consortium, and that really helps us because these are tough conversations and difficult subjects, and so we don't really know how to have those conversations, because we didn't know that these things necessarily existed. And so the gender supply chain assessment that I talked about a little bit earlier, that will provide us with a much clearer idea of what's happening, and again, what are some of the barriers that women are facing in our supply chains, and the impact on PepsiCo, as well as what some of those opportunities are. And that co-creation space will really give us an opportunity to think about what are the solutions that we want to create. And I mentioned this a little bit before, but it could be, does it make sense to create a brand new demo farm that is female run alongside the traditional ones that we have? Does it make more sense to have the traditional demo farm, but then invite different people to it and have different kind of training days, ones where we bring everybody in at the same time, or we bring in like men who are usually showing up, and then women get a different day or a different time, just so that I think we're open to all of those things, because this is a new space for us. But we are increasingly aware of unintended consequences. And, in some of the countries that we're going to be doing this in, like, it's a little bit easier to think about like empowering women as a business than in others. We've got, a place like Colombia, for example, has a history of a civil war. There's history of like land grabs. There's history of like violence against women, and that's very different from a place like Pakistan, and different from a place like Uttar Pradesh in India. So we're relying a lot on the expertise of our partners to be able to help us navigate this space, so that we can do it on our own, just knowing that we're not there yet. And we're not there yet as a team, which means that we need to change the behavior and like the mindset of our own colleagues. So it's going to take a little bit, and it's a sticky, to be honest, it's a sticky place. And that's why we're working in partnership with other organizations to help us understand that.
Yeah, for us.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Lauren.
I was just going to, on the topic of gender-based violence, another thing that came out of the March 8th executive order, which established the Gender Policy Council at the White House. President Biden has also issued a directive for the US government to create a national action plan to end gender-based violence. This is something that we will take up both domestically and abroad. So in coordination with efforts already ongoing overseas, and the National Action Plan, we have experience doing what we call NAPs, very much so in the women, peace, and security space, for example. But a national action plan is done in consultation between a government, civil society, other stakeholders like the private sector, and it's really a concerted effort to bring together multiple stakeholders, multiple perspectives within society toward a common goal with specific milestones and associated action plans. So this. Both the executive order itself, but President Biden calling out explicitly efforts to tackle gender-based violence, recognizing that GBV has risen as a result of the pandemic, as a result of quarantine and other measures. So this is something that we're taking very seriously and paying even higher attention to in this administration.
I think that's amazing. I think the role culture plays in gender-based violence cannot be underestimated. We have a public-private partnership, or I guess a private-private partnership, where we work with garment factories, because those are oftentimes the tip of spear in terms of formal labor for women. In many countries in Asia, but many countries in the world too. And so we work with them based on some research that was done actually by the World Bank and Harvard that showed that if you took and transitioned payroll from cash to digital, so you open savings accounts or wallets, that you saw that women were able to weather financial crises more easily. And over 6 months, they had actually started to accumulate savings, which improves their overall financial security. And so based on this research, based on work that so one of our partners had done previously, we went and we said, how can we democratize access to the training that goes along with these digital products? The products, the first country that this was done in was Bangladesh. And so as we were going through the journey, one of the things that we realized very early on is on payday, which happens once a month, you can see all the men lined up outside the factory, whether it's the uncle, the husband, the father, sort of waiting for the women to come out and hand over the cash. And so one of the concerns was, if you transition to digital payroll, you need to have upfront those early conversations around what's going to happen on payday, because you can't just not show up and not hand over money without there being ramifications, or what we assume would be ramifications in the household. And so how do you start to empower women ahead of the product rollout so that they are prepared to, that they are educating their families and their households, and they're using that opportunity to start to have conversations around joint financial planning, joint financial decision making. And what was really valuable for us is that we built that into the training that goes along, sort of how do you manage your money better? How do you think about saving for a goal? All the different other financial literacy and digital literacy pieces that were quite pragmatic. We also built that in, and we did it through a peer-to-peer model where we have a digital wage toolkit that has videos, has exercises, so that peers can teach one another within the factory. And we work with factories to make certain that they are giving us time during their workday to be able to implement this training. And partly why the factories are willing to do this is that we have global partnerships with really progressive brands that feel the value and the importance of women's economic empowerment. And so they create pressure in their own supply chain around how can we make changes that benefit everybody. And because we want this to be commercially sustainable social impact, we want it to be impact that scales, that sustains after the philanthropic money pulls out. Our partner has worked very hard in terms of creating the business case for the brand's perspective, but the business case also from the factory's perspective. So when you transition, there's an upfront cost. At what point do you break even? What are the hidden costs of handling all that cash? What does that do to productivity? And building that business case helps the factory to feel comfortable, both in terms of taking that leap from what has been their business as usual, but also carving out time on their factory floor to enable women to actually receive the training and the know-how that's critical for them to be successful. And so incorporating that gender-based violence or training against gender-based violence or to mitigate gender-based violence, we think needs to be part and parcel, particularly when you're dealing with money and women.
Thank you, Allison. It's really great to hear these comments because I remember the time when this was not an issue that companies discussed at all, and people would also just kind of relegate this issue to the realm of government. And so it's really kind of nice to hear that the business case is being made, and there's data to show how important this issue is, because there's a UN study that shows that it costs the world economy 2% of global GDP by not addressing gender-based violence, and you could have another $1.5 trillion in growth if you addressed the productivity losses that come from GBV as well. So thank you for those comments. And we have a number of other questions from the audience. We'll come to you in a little bit. In the meantime, we also wanted to expand on our discussion on partnerships and really address, how do you make partnerships work? Because we've had NGOs that came to our working group series as well who raised this, how do you actually make the business case to a company to partner with you? And beyond the partnerships that companies have been doing with USAID, there are global NGOs that are funded by USAID and other donors. So how does an NGO go to a company and pitch sort of a gender lens partnership to them? And what are the things that you're looking for as a company that kind of make these partnerships work, and how do you bridge the two worlds? And I want to hear the same from Lauren as well in terms of kind of government's focus on partnerships and how do you bridge sort of the language gap and the time horizons, et cetera. So who would like to take that one first?
Sure, I can do that. So for us, we don't do a lot of sort of unsolicited proposals, if that makes sense, even though we are the philanthropic arm of the company. We have a strategic plan in a country as to how we're going to go about implementing, and then we sort of stick to that strategic plan. In terms of creating new partnerships, I've had personally the benefit of sitting sort of on different sides of the table, right? So I was with USAID for well over a decade. I worked at an NGO, I worked in impact investing, I worked at a foundation, I worked at MasterCard. So one of the things I've seen is that the private sector, it's hard to pitch something that is so far afield. Well, so there's two ways to do it, right? So sorry, I'm going to start again. So if you're working with a company that really sees their philanthropic giving separate from what the business does, then your unsolicited proposal or your pitch as to what that collaboration might look like may or may not be successful, right? Like it kind of just depends on who you hit. But if you're looking for a collaboration where it fits within what the business does, then I think one, it's how do you find that right internal champion to make certain that, because you can ask the same question to the 260,000 people at PepsiCo and probably get 260,000 different answers depending on what time of day you hit them, right? And absolutely the same thing's true for MasterCard. And I think that those collaborations I have found are a lot easier when we're talking, when it's honestly private sector to private sector, because we see we have similar time frames, right? We talk the same language. And even with my business colleagues, when we do things with USAID, oftentimes I play an intermediary role just because what they're saying doesn't land with what USAID is trying to drive. And what USAID is saying is so nuanced and holistic in nature. And I understand exactly what they're trying to say, and they see sort of the vision. But from my colleague's standpoint, they'll get off the call and be like, they didn't say anything. Like they don't want to, like it really is a different language. And so when you're thinking about how do you bridge those partnerships, I really think you need to put yourself in the other person's shoes as to what do they really care about, not what do you want them to care about, and then start the conversation from that standpoint. So if you are trying to have a public-private partnership on gender-based violence or whatever that issue is, why would the business first care? And if your answer is, well, you should care because you care about women, then you're probably not setting up yourself for the right conversation. You should probably be going to the philanthropic art part of the company and starting there, because it's just, it's not that they don't care. It's just, that's not what their day-to-day job is. And you're starting with, I'm going to help you with your day-to-day job because this is a partnership that we're trying to scale.
Jeff?
Well, Allison kind of took my answer. So
You got to go first next time, Jeff.
I know. Like I got these notes written down. It's like, oh, that's it. That was it. Yeah, that one's it. So I think you know, Allison, you hit the nail on the head. I literally wrote down, solve my problem, not yours, is probably is a good way to start this. And there is a very big difference between the short and long-term interests of a corporate foundation and a corporate like function. And the KPIs and the timeframes of those two different groups are very different. One thing that Allison brought up is this like kind of intercultural interlocutor or kind of cross-cultural connector. And I think that there's more and more companies that are hiring people who come from the world of development or come from the world of government. And so we are developing that skill set fairly rapidly. And so an implementer who comes and says, I can help you understand USAID or the World Bank, like not really that interesting, to be perfectly honest, because we got that. We need people who can get things done, because those are our KPIs are results. We will get hired or fired or promoted based on those results. And the number of meetings that we do is not one of the KPIs. I think one of the other things to keep in mind is that has worked for me is when I've worked with a lot of my colleagues is how is what I'm doing going to save money now, save reduce cost or reduce risk or reduce headache in the long term, or go after an opportunity that we couldn't necessarily go after on our own. And it's a very different kind of conversation with each one of those, but that I try to boil it down to almost like the P&L, the profit loss statement. Like, how do these things impact the P&L? And these are things that are different. These are things that are more open to the conversation that we're having now, right? It's not just the type of potato and when you put it in the ground and the type of fertilizer that you put on it. When you do that, it's things like the crop rotation. What type of soil do you have? What are the other crops that are going in the ground before and after the potato? Who's planting it? Are women involved? Like, are you talking to them? Are you training them? Are they engaged? Are they doing the bookkeeping? Then, like, how do we work with them there? Are they, how are these dynamics part of the P&L is a really important piece. And so that conversation as an implementer coming to a company, I think starting small, building relationships, don't come with like a $3 million proposal when we don't even know you. Like, that's not how our bank accounts work. We have very small amounts of money this year because it's already been programmed. And then if you prove yourself, then we can get more money for you because that's the way our budget cycles work. So you start small, something that's connected to the P&L that lands well with us or lands well with our partners, and then we can grow with you, I think is some of the best advice that I could give, building on what Allison has already said.
You know, I completely agree. And I guess one other thing that I would say that we've started to do is to really look at right, so MasterCard's a technology company in the payment space, right? So we don't issue the credit card, even though everyone thinks we do. Banks, our customers do. Like we are the rails that those transactions get processed on. But because of this, like we're a network of networks, right? So we have digital partners, we have bank partners. And so one of the things we've started to do to try to help bridge that connection between the development space, particularly around women's issues, and our customers, is to provide support to them to better tailor products and services, for example. So we have a global collaboration with CARE, where by 2022 we'll have reached over, I'm going to get the number wrong, 3.9 million entrepreneurs by working through bank partners to improve their tailoring of products and services. And the reason why is that CARE has been working with women entrepreneurs at the base of the pyramid for decades, right? So they actually have this knowledge. The bank does not, because the bank sits way up here and has been attending to the affluent. And so how do you help to get CARE's expertise in front of product owners in the bank to say, what would make sense? Why do women entrepreneurs want this? Why not that? And helping to bring that knowledge into the bank setting. And because the banks are receptive to doing this, it has this incredible, very fast cascading effect through an entire market. And so I think, as you think about public-private partnerships, as Jeff pointed out, you could go directly to the company and you have to solve the problem that they have, and you have to build that relationship. But we, at least on our side, are starting to toy with, are there other ways in which we can facilitate this? Because we recognize that it's not that easy for nonprofit organizations to A, connect into the private sector, and B, to get their attention, right? Get their attention and have the patience to build that relationship, because there's so many. And, I'm in the philanthropic side, so I know this, but if you're Jeff and you're on the supplier side, do you know every NGO and the reputation that they have? Like that in and of itself is a job, right? So just something to think about.
And I'll just add quickly to that. I think a lot of the themes that Allison and Jeff pointed out, particularly about making the case to the private sector, to the specific specific company on how are you helping to identify with their strategic interests. That also applies to the US government, aligning with our own policy priorities, our priorities in a given country or regional context. But the feedback loop between our partners on the ground, between the private sector, civil society, is so important to us to inform what our priorities are. We may go in with a particular strategy, but that needs to be open to change depending on what we hear from partners and others on the ground. And I think for NGOs approaching public-private partnerships, another really important role they can play is to help us and the private sector as well to identify the champions on the ground. So, of course, willing private sector partners, but also champions in the host government. Political will is so important for us to really make any initiative successful. And also to help kind of bridge those important conversations, those dialogues between government, private sector, civil society, and others. And then finally, I think another key role that NGOs can play is, we've talked a bit about adapting different programs and initiatives to different regional contexts, taking lessons learned. And that's so important as well, as we're thinking about taking a new project or priority into a new context. Having a partner with that experience, even if it's from another country or regional context, can help us to start the conversations to really hit the ground running. So just some ideas from my perspective.
Thank you all. Those are really important insights, especially as this working group focuses a lot on kind of how to make partnerships work. So we have a number of questions that came in through the chat, so maybe we can transition to those now. And I can just leave them open for anyone who would like to answer them. One of them is about the impact of gender lens investments. So when you decide through a company sustainability initiative or philanthropic initiative to invest in gender equality in a particular country, are you also doing an analysis of the community impact, and what do those designs look like of gender lens investments that are targeted towards lifting up entire communities? And maybe with that, you could also address kind of other stakeholders that you might work with besides the country's government or other kind of critical stakeholders that you've had to work with within your projects. So who would like to take that first? Allison, can I call on you maybe?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we don't do, I don't know if I'm actually splicing words, but we don't do investments in the sort of impact investing sense of the word. So the types of investments we do are certainly philanthropic and are more program based, although we do some academic research and some convenings as well. So I may not be answering the exact question, but we do look at the variety of stakeholders in a particular community as we're designing a program. I know that the question wasn't specific to government, but as Lauren said, political will is really important. And to the degree that we want to see transformative change, we feel very strongly that engaging the government, whether it's local or national or even provincial, early on so that they are part of the solution is important to eventually hoping that a success is something that's replicated at a state level and not necessarily solely driven by philanthropic money.
I can go next, just on the topic of gender lens investment. I wanted to highlight the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, and our 2X initiative, which has to date catalyzed more than $7 billion of private sector investment in women-owned and women-led businesses, and also in businesses and products and services that are designed to empower women. I don't need to tell this group that women as powerful drivers of job creation and entrepreneurship, we recognize the value that we can bring through this investment mechanism. So this has been a really big priority for the DFC, and as one of our top priorities and programs under women's economic empowerment. I would highlight as well, just on the topic of other stakeholders and partners that help to inform our work. I think, private sector associations and foundations. So for example, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, we just supported an event that they had just ahead of International Women's Day. We also look to private sector partners and associations like the National Center for APEC, which has been very forward-leaning, very much a driver of women's economic empowerment initiatives in the Asia Pacific region, and helps to inform our work in that region as well. In Africa, we have the President's Advisory Council on Doing Business in Africa, which is also a huge resource for us to help us understand the challenges and opportunities in trade and investment in sub-Saharan Africa, and to help us to inform our policies in that way. And going back just to gender lens investing and taking a gender lens to our policy priorities, our policy issues. The Biden administration has also prioritized gender mainstreaming in our efforts. So looking at gender impacts across the spectrum of priorities across the US government. We also regularly, whether it's in my office, the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues, USAID, really across the US government, as we're implementing projects on the ground, we're doing gender analyses to better understand specific impacts on women and men, taking into account, specific limitations that may, for example, restrict women's ability to participate in a program as equally as men, and making those changes so that we have more equal and equitable participation.
I think the community level kind of impact question is an interesting one. And I had a couple things that I wrote down. One is that, like, this idea of silos is pretty common. I think my experience with the corporate world is that there's laser focus, and that's why business is really good at what business does, is that because it really focuses like a laser on specific things and does those things really well. It doesn't really lend itself to a holistic perspective. That's just, it's hard to be good at one thing if you have to be thinking about all things. But I think that is changing. And I've seen that in a lot of the announcements that a lot of companies and their sustainable business agendas have been starting to put out, moving from, like, we're just doing this thing and this thing and this thing, and then you create teams to just do that thing and then that thing and then that thing. And now looking at circular economy or regenerative agriculture, these are concepts that are forcing a lot of different functions to work together, because one function can't be successful doing that without involving the other function. And that's just within the company itself. And keep in mind that that's at multiple levels. And then you bring in the different partners, and that's municipal government. It could be the different NGOs at the global or the international level. But I think those silos are starting to break down because of the nature of the problems are so much more complex, and you can't take a siloed approach to them. I think I'm also seeing this idea of focusing on a commodity and then moving to, and if I just focus on a commodity, then I just need to get that commodity. And if I get it from Ghana, great. If I don't get it from Ghana, but I can get it from Ukraine, perfectly fine, right? And that is moving to this idea that we need the farmer, or we need the people within the supply chain to be resilient, to be sustainable. So we need to start thinking about those people, right? Which then ties back into women's economic empowerment, that if you can't have a good solution if you don't solve for women. But usually if you solve for women, you're going to have a pretty good solution, that in my personal opinion. And that, I think that is starting to move into this idea of sustainable landscapes and like the places as becoming more and more important, and focusing on the sustainability of those regions or those places and the people within them. And I think the work that I'm working on, we're doing that a lot. And I wrote down the words like regenerative agriculture, sustainable landscapes. A number of the partnerships, including the ones that we've talked about today, are providing the space for us to think about the community, to think about that physical place, and buying us time to prove to to colleagues and to internal and industry colleagues that thinking just about the silo is not going to cut it anymore. And there is a business case for thinking beyond that particular set, like those very narrow set of factors that figure into your KPIs as a professional.
Thank you, Jeff. Really important insights as well. And I think that this is something that NGOs spend a lot of time thinking about, what kind of community impact are we having through our gender lens interventions, as well as in specific investments. I'll move to another question, which is kind of related to the community aspect of things. Someone asked about the question of engaging men, because we tend to have a lot of these conversations about gender equity issues kind of in a community of women, whether it's on International Women's Day and events that we have here in the US, or kind of within communities focusing on women's barriers issues, where women's collectives are the ones discussing a lot of these issues. So just wondering how you're making an effort to engage men within the communities as you're working, let's say in farming communities, as you mentioned, like men hold a lot of power, or in financial services. So just curious about if there are targeted initiatives to support conversations with men.
Yeah, everything that we're doing has to involve men. And so again, going back to that, it's a tricky conversation that we're getting into, and the power of these partnerships is that we're leveraging the expertise of folks who have spent a lot more time having these conversations. I think, yeah, it's a little bit of starting a conversation around like you could do things better is probably the best way to put it. So it's not as off-putting of like, a company coming in and saying you have to do these things. It's more like we have part of our sustainable farming program is it's a protocol of practices that you have to hit. You need to be part of this program in order to sell to us. This is potato. You need to have these things to sell to us, and so how are you doing? And if you're not hitting those things, like, cool, what are the different ways that we can help you make sure that you're verified so that you can continue to work with us and continue to grow with us? And then finding that, is your wife doing most of the bookkeeping? Usually, yes. Like, have you invited her to any of the trainings? Like, have you invited her to any of the financial management kind of trainings that we want to put on? It's probably a good idea, because that helps you improve your own productivity, your own profitability. If you have someone doing the books who's involved in, who knows what's going on, right? Are we inviting, now we're thinking about, can we invite women to like trainings on agrochemical storage and, fertilizer kind of, I'm losing the word, but when you put fertilizer on a field, it's really, it's super early here. So I'm still waking up. You can do things better. You're going to hit these targets faster and cheaper if you are inviting like your wife or your daughter or your different workers, and just, it is the business case for the farmer as much as it is the business case for us. So I think that's how we're taking it. And we're, admittedly, we have to take it slow because it's a new space for us, and we really we can't alienate our farmers. And so we know that it's a touchy subject, especially in some of the countries where we're working.
It's interesting that you point that out, Jeff. So oftentimes what we find is this bifurcation between men and women and treating them as if they're wholly separate is inaccurate, because most decisions, like women will decide, this is probably a little bit too broad of a statement, but women decide to work in part because they're worried about their household, right? Men are working because they're worried about their household. And so if you're joining things together to talk about the well-being of the household, it starts to open up a conversation, at least we find. And I think, in terms of direct interventions, absolutely, there's that piece. But I think there's also indirect or more subtle ways to start to break down gender stereotypes and the implications that go along with it. So for example, in India, in a previous program that we ran, that worked with jewelry artisans who were predominantly men, in part because in India, a lot of these formal businesses are run by men. We created an animated female protagonist who provides superhero advice. And it was a digital training approach, which was highly successful. And we debated for a long time up front with our implementer as to, would a female cartoon character resonate with men? Like, would they just dismiss it automatically? Like, is that how the culture would play out? And we decided that we would take the risk anyway, not knowing whether or not it would land and resonate with folks, because we thought, like, this is one very subtle way to start to break down the idea that women don't know about money, women don't know about financial decision making, women don't know about how to run businesses. And we do a fair amount in terms of trying to add in humor to soften it so it doesn't feel preachy. But it was a very conscientious decision on our side of, there's direct ways to tackle it, but there's also indirect ways that are equally important, because as you start to aggregate those across all the different companies and all the different civil society players and governments, you do start to change the frame through which people look at things.
Lauren, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I think in general, we can't be effective if we aren't fully engaging men and boys in these efforts. We need, just like we need, women represent 50% of society, and we need women's full participation to have a productive, or as productive as an economy as we can. We need that 50% of men to help support and empower women. We need men, I think in particular, to support women in rising to leadership positions. So in governments, on corporate boards, in local government, men need to, there are these unconscious biases and cultural barriers, and there's a broad education effort that needs to happen, not just to help women to be more empowered themselves, but to help men support women in rising to leadership positions, to have that diversity that's so important to make organizations, governments, businesses more effective. And it's something that even in the US government, that we are always reminding ourselves of, thinking, how can we develop more champions for these issues among men, and better engage men and boys. So I think it's a conversation that we need to continue having.
Thank you all. These are really important insights on this issue. We always kind of wrestled with how do we engage men and boys productively in these conversations. It's definitely a journey. So I'll come to the final question from the audience, and then we'll wrap up with some final thoughts from each of you. But this is actually kind of more of a query about an interest area in the issue of refugees and displaced populations. Women are ultimately half of these populations and have special needs. So in the context of also the global crisis we have going on right now, where in a number of different regions of the world, there are kind of migrant crises happening. Just curious if your companies are looking at these issues and what kind of interventions you might be focused on that might have a gender lens as well.
So interestingly, with MasterCard, not through the Philanthropic Hub, but actually through the business, we have a product that we work with NGOs on that is a digital ID, so that if you're a refugee and you've fled without your papers, you land in another country, how do you start to access services that are provided either through the host government or through civil society? And how do you ensure that you're getting the right, that you're, well, from an NGO's perspective, how do you make certain that the NGO is targeting the right people and you're not, everybody's not focused on the same group or the same refugee camp, so that you're able to even more evenly distribute humanitarian relief, but then from the refugees' perspective, providing them sufficient dignity to decide what do they want, what do they need, how can they best support their own family. And so this digital ID it allows for sort of anonymized, aggregated information to be shared across NGOs, so that you're protecting the refugee's identity, because that can be particularly difficult depending on the situation, but allows it sufficient information so that there's an organization of the marketplace, if that makes sense. Like, and I know it's not really a marketplace, but an organization of all the different stakeholders who are showing up to help. And certainly the Syrian conflict has been quite difficult, but you can take this same idea and the same product and say, what happens when there's a tsunami or there's a flood or a landslide or a typhoon? And you have just a number of different organizations coming in very quickly, but then also, quite frankly, leaving very quickly. Like, what happens to the refugees afterwards, and how do you ensure that they have an identity that they can carry with them as they move from one location to the other?
Thank you, Allison. And while you have the floor, do you want to share some final thoughts about this topic of furthering gender-based partnerships from your experience?
Yeah, I guess my one parting thought would be that when you're thinking about collaborating with the private sector, certainly there's money, right? That the corporates are known for having some budget, depending on sort of who you're talking to and whether it's philanthropic or from the business side. But I would encourage all of you to not think of corporates solely as the bank, right? That really you should be thinking about what are the assets that the company has and why would they be a good partner? So looking at everything from the supply chains and the connections that they have to their influence and role with government, to the assets and the products and the services that the company might offer. Because I think that whole array is the real strength that private sectors bring when they collaborate to drive social impact.
Thank you. Jeff?
Nothing more that I have already said, but other than like I think we're in this together, and super excited for these opportunities to work with organizations like USAID and the Inter-American Development Bank and others, and some of these implementers like ICRW or Resonance, to really like help us on this journey. And I think that a lot of companies, starting with the global ones, who are out in front, in recognizing that these are issues that we want and need to address and don't necessarily know how to do that. But that's also, I mean, there's only so many multinational corporations out there. There's a lot of local companies that are grappling with these issues in a very real way. It's not just the PepsiCos or the MasterCards or whoever it is. I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of companies at the local level that recognize these as challenges and opportunities and are trying to do something about that. And I think that we have to work together to address these issues and to take advantage of these opportunities, especially, for us, this is a huge opportunity to address some of the challenges that we see, especially, things that are coming up or happening, like climate change and the impact of climate change, gender-informed solutions to the impact of climate change. I don't think we can do it we can't address climate change if we don't have a gender-informed, and gender-smart set of solutions, full stop.
Thank you so much. Lauren, you have the final word.
Thank you. This has been a really great conversation. I fully concur with Jeff that we're all in this together. Also really appreciate what he just raised on climate change and gender smart solutions to climate change and environmental issues. That will, of course, be a priority for us as well. I mentioned women in leadership, and just wanted to reiterate how important it will be in our economic recovery following COVID-19 for women to be drivers of that recovery, both from a business perspective and also in leading government response efforts. So just wanted to highlight that. And a couple other ways I think the private sector can play a greater role in ways that we can work together. We didn't get a chance to talk much about data today, but I think, to the extent that the private sector can help us to collect sex disaggregated data, the impacts of various initiative situations on the ground. And we're also, in our efforts, taking more of an intersectional lens to our data collection. So not just gender, but aspects of race, disability, socioeconomic status as well. And all of these indicators are so important in how we structure our policy and programs. And then finally, related to COVID-19, COVID has definitely elevated the disproportionate share of care responsibilities in the home that fall to women. And this is something that we're looking at very carefully in our own recovery efforts, something that the Biden administration has also included in this March 8th executive order on the Gender Policy Council, and definitely an area where the private sector can continue to be a leader in creating flexible workplace policies, and in showing, we going back to the business case, and there is a strong business case for making sure that men and women are able to take advantage of those policies that can help to create more balanced care responsibilities in the home. So thank you all so much for this conversation today, and I look forward to continuing this great conversation. Thank you.
And thank you all from my end, from Nathan Associates and also from SID. And you all brought such unique perspectives. I'm sure there'll be some kind of follow-up request to connect with each of you. So if I have your permission, I might come back to you with some follow-up projects and questions as well from the audience. So thank you all for joining. This has been an excellent conversation on gender issues, on partnerships, and I hope that you'll continue to engage with the working group as we do this and also attend our next event in April. And thank you to SID for having us. And I'll turn it over to Paul about the survey that they're doing about the event. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Shamrook, and thanks to Allison, Jeff, and Lauren for participating today. We really do appreciate your comments and feedback on this important topic. Before we wrap up, I just want to mention the survey, as Shamrook just mentioned. We really would appreciate your feedback, and we do really take it into consideration as we move forward and do events in the future. So please fill that out. My colleague Jamal posted it in the chat box, so you can find it there. But thanks again, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event.